The red real estate sign stood beside my bedroom window, bright against the apple trees, when Mara said, "Your mother's room will be ready by Friday." She was holding a folder with my name, misspelled, on a deed draft. Daniel stood behind her, silent. A moving van was already waiting near the farm gate, and I understood that my family had made a decision about my home before they had bothered to tell me. She smiled at me the way you smile at a partner in a plan. I felt my smile go thin and brittle. I told her I did not need a room prepared. This was my house. She did not look surprised. She looked only relieved, as if the hard part was finished and the house had finally bent to common sense. We had been sleeping in the back bedroom since Robert died 3 years ago. The bed in the front room felt wrong without him. It was too wide and too quiet. Daniel and Mara had come to live with us in the early months after their bakery went under. They needed somewhere to rebuild, and I had never liked to watch my family founder on some windless afternoon if I could help. I had been married to Robert for 47 years. He taught me to notice small gestures, to spot a person's bluff, and to keep things that mattered where I could lay a hand on them quickly when storms came. The farm is 42 acres of orchard and fields, and a white farmhouse that leans slightly to greet the sun. The apple trees are older than most of the wires in town. Put your palm against a trunk, and you could feel the slow blood of seasons in them. Robert planted most of that orchard. He liked things that took time. He liked rows and the honesty of fruit. We spoke about saving the land when we were young and stubborn. We spoke about passing it along gently, not as an inheritance but as a stewardship. Our initials are carved into an old barn beam if you know where to look. I let Daniel and Mara come in, because Daniel is my son, and because I believed at the time that we were a small family that could hold each other. Daniel was ashamed when the bakery failed. He kept saying he needed a place to think, to plan the next thing. He was proud and clumsy and honest about the things he could not control. Mara was quieter about what she needed. She had an eye for the practical. Where Daniel wanted to rebuild a business around bread and comfort, Mara saw a rural market, a wedding venue, an estate sold at the right price. At first they stayed in the little tenant cottage that sits near the creek. That should have been enough, but Mara wanted in the house. She said her elderly mother needed a quieter room, and it would be easier if they lived closer to town. They began to say "we" as if the farm had already folded them into its map. The first violation was small. It did not seem like a violation until you had to climb into a box and find the corner of your life softened by someone's finger. One afternoon, Mara moved my knitting basket into a basket by the stove and labeled it needlework and donations. She made a list of things she thought belonged to the local charity. She carried framed photographs from the mantel to a bedroom closet and stacked them with a policy like an inventory. She told me it would be easier if I reduced my clutter. Daniel did not protest. I did not either, not at first. The basket was still knit in a hand that remembered other winters. The second violation was the real estate agent with a wide smile and a brochure. He parked in the lane and walked up with a business card, like a small animal. Mara had called him without telling me and invited him to see the orchard. She told him, by phone, that the house might be on the market and that an antique buyer was interested in the barn. He arrived with a pair of gloves and an appetite for negotiation. I made tea and tried to smile. He walked through the rooms as if they were properties in his mind. He made a note by the back door and told me how lovely the view would be for someone who wanted to retire. When he left, Mara stood by the window with his card in her fingers. She said she was only gauging interest, nothing more. The red sign came a day later, thumbed into our earth like a promise. Sign, it said. For sale. It was not illegal to gauge interest, but it was not mine to gauge. It was not mine to give or to let go. A few days after the sign I had a fall. Not a grand fall, but an accident that sent me to the emergency room with a sprained hip and an order of rest. Daniel swung into action in that way sons do when they want to feel useful. He called Mara and Mara called me. In the hospital a nurse took notes, a doctor ordered an x-ray, and Mara sat in the chair by my bed with a folder on her lap. The hospital corridor smelled of bleach and disinfectant, and the small green curtains shivered when people passed. At one point Mara tapped the folder. It looked perfectly ordinary, she said casually, while the doctor checked my chart. That is an estate update. It is routine. We should make sure everything is in order. I do not remember being asked to sign anything. My memory is good enough to know who I am, where I live, and where my keys are kept. But if I were not here, if I could no longer manage the house, the paperwork would need to be in place. It was a tidy argument, practical, neighborly. I skimmed the pages. Some things were expected, dates, names. Then something slid like a small stone in my pocket. A page was missing. There was a blank in the middle of the document where a clause should have been. Mara noticed I noticed. She smiled the same way she had smiled at the sign. I said, "No. There is a page missing. I will not sign if pages are missing." She did not scold me. She tried to redirect. She said it was only an update. She said lawyers prefer a single signature and we could add the rest later. She said my doctor was not the person to ask. She said the hospital was a good place because of the nurse's witness. People say many things in corridors with bright lighting. Her voice had the calmness of someone rehearsed. I did not sign. I had never been hurried into such an intimate change before. Old papers have the dignity of wrinkles and stamps and signatures. I have always kept original wills in a safe place. Robert did this too. He kept his papers in a black leather box, in the bank's safe deposit. It is a small ritual. When you have been married as long as we were, you carve your small plans into the margins and hide them in places that do not attract attention. After my hospital discharge, the family began to speak of my forgetfulness, as if it were a room we could walk into and tour. Relatives called and said gentle things, as if they were pointing at evidence. Mara told people I had been confused, that the fall was perhaps the first sign of something more. That was the fourth violation, the telling of others, the painting of me in soft colors, so decisions could be taken like a kitchen remodel. I kept a journal after that. I dated everything and wrote down what we said, who was in the room, and what the atmosphere felt like. It felt silly and powerful all at once. I went to the bank one morning with Daniel. He was quiet in the gray light. We walked past the hedges that Robert used to trim and into the vault room. I opened a safe deposit box with an old key that had been his. The key had a weight to it of other lives. Inside there were 2 envelopes. One was the original will. It was folded with the care of long use. The other was a sealed envelope with my name and the date Robert had written. In case of family coercion only. If you open this before, you must open it only under the conditions we discussed. He signed it with his initials. He had a way of writing his initials like a stamp. I did not open the sealed letter then. I put it into my handbag, the way you put an extra umbrella into your car. Keep it, but do not use it unless needed. That was when I made 2 choices. One choice was obvious and quick. I would call my lawyer, Helen Park. Helen had been Robert's lawyer and my friend for years. She knew the old family agreements and the way Robert liked to leave things tidy. A second choice was quieter. I would not rage. I would not make a scene. I would document. I would create a trail that said this was not consent. Helen answered on the 3rd ring and there was no small talk. She listened when I told her about the missing page in Mara's folder, and the red sign and the real estate agent. She did not promise fireworks. She told me to breathe and to collect copies of anything Mara had given me. She said, if they have already set an agent to look through the property that shows intent. We need facts more than fury. Come to my office Monday. Bring whatever you have. She did not explain Robert's sealed envelope. When I tried to ask her about it, she was quieter than the chair in her office. She said over the phone, I cannot tell you anything over the phone. There are reasons. Trust me to be thorough. Do not open anything you do not need to yet. Her refusal turned the sealed envelope into a larger question. Why would she decline to say anything by phone? Part of me wanted to snap the seal in the car and read it under the dealership lights. Part of me wanted to leave it until I had a lawyer's presence and a recorder. I decided to leave it closed and to collect evidence. Over the next weeks, the violations accrued like late frost. Mara moved my grandmother's silverware into boxes labeled for storage. She locked the desk drawer that had held Robert's letters and told me it was better to have a lock for security. She wrote a note to her mother-in-law's cousin saying that Margaret was losing her memory and would benefit from some professional care. She invited my sister to a brunch and told her that the orchard might be sold to pay for medical expenses. Each step was small and reasonable when taken alone. Stacked together, they became a plan. I learned two things about small plans. 1. People learn to say compassionate things when they want someone to step aside. 2. A person can be coerced slowly until the new shape of things seems natural. Daniel watched most of this with a face that tightened like hummingbirds' wings. He did not like Mara's speed. He did not like how she smoothed over corners of my life. He wanted to keep order. He also had debts he had not told me, and the temptation to accept Mara's shopping lists for the business was heavy upon him. He began to say to me in private, quietly, "You should let me handle it, mother. Let me make the investment." I felt his shame as much as his need. The shame of a son who had failed is a loud thing in private kitchens. One evening during a family dinner, where my apple pies sat on the table like treaty offers, Mara brought out a copy of a will. She laid it before me like an invisible judge. That was the fifth violation. The page had the old handwriting of a lawyer and a seal. Mara announced that this was the latest version, and that it had been signed years ago. She said Robert had thought ahead, and that everything was already arranged the way they had discussed. She read a paragraph about the distribution of property. People nodded. Relatives who had been quiet at the edges of the table entered the conversation with that special hunger of persons who smell certainty. I looked at the paper and noticed a word that my husband always used, spelled wrong. It was as if someone had tried to copy his hand and missed his small habit. Later, when I compared that sheet to the will in the bank, it became obvious that the paper Mara had brought was a forgery. It had the same names but not the same rhythm. They had tried to make a replacement of his voice, and failed to catch the small things that make a person. Daniel saw me looking at the paper. I saw him look away and feel something break inwardly. He did not speak up. That silence would be the thing that later ate at him. I did not accuse anyone that night. I passed my hands through the apples, feeling the cool skins like a rosary. I said nothing sharp. I put the pie away and went to bed early. They talked into the night about buyers and remodeling and a possible sale. They spoke as if I were a picture on a wall. The sealed letter grew in my handbag like a held breath. Robert's instructions had always been particular. Once, at a county fair, we had watched two men argue over a prize pig. Robert had told me then that agreements are like fences. They mean little until you set the posts. He had always been worried that land would be treated like merchandise. I had not understood how his worry would come back to live. I went to Helen's office early the next week. She sat across from me at a low table and opened a manila file with the determination of a person who has read books about long, complicated things. She had a way of folding her hands that made silence like a tool. We spoke about what had happened. She looked at the forged will and compared it to the original I had brought from the bank. Her quiet pause was not impatience. It was the exact sound of someone taking great care. She said, "I will not explain the sealed letter over the phone, because it contains conditional language that is delicate and could be misconstrued. That is why. You were right to bring it. I will need to witness what you do with it." Her refusal to say more made the sealed letter into more than paper. It became a hinge. The next days were a study in carefulness. I made lists. I recorded conversations. Not with any intention of dramatic confrontation, but with the intention that truth be traceable. I wrote the times people came and left. I kept copies of mailings. I took photographs of the red sign and the agent's business card. I started to carry a small voice recorder in my handbag. I told Helen each step and she told me what might matter. She told me nothing of the sealed letter, except that she would bring her files and attend any family meeting I asked for. It was Daniel who finally reached a snapping point. He had been trying every which way to salvage the bakery from other places while pretending I did not know. He had sold a few pans and borrowed from friends. He owed money to people who had no time for explanations. One afternoon he stood in the orchard and let out a breath that was not laughter and not a complaint, and told me, "I thought this would fix things. I thought if Mara's plan worked, it would give us a cushion. I thought we could start again." I looked at his hands. They were the same hands that had held my cheek when Robert died. I felt the way love complicates judgment. I did not forgive him at once. I did not need to. I needed him to see clearly. The turning point came when he heard Mara on the phone. She was telling her mother that I had already agreed to the sale and that the farm would eventually become theirs. Daniel overheard the tone, the assumption, the way she spoke about me as if I were a story someone else told. He went pale. The next thing I heard was a slammed door and the sound of running steps. He left the house and came back an hour later with his face raw. He knelt in front of me and said, I did not know she would say that. I felt my lack of courage. I felt the shame of being in debt and deceit booked into the same hour. We spoke then with a new honesty. He told me about the debts. He told me about how Mara had presented an alluring plan of renovations, of new customers, of renting the cottage and launching a wedding farm. She had promised him a role. He had wanted to believe. He had not dodged the idea of selling the land completely. It felt like an impossible thought, but the key thing this confession did was make him begin to feel the weight of his complicity. For the first time he seemed to understand he was not simply a victim of circumstance. He had also been a participant in a plan that took me by degrees. I told him I forgave him, but that forgiveness would not be free. Trust must be rebuilt, like a fence after a storm, with nails and patience, and the willingness to drive in each post. He agreed. He promised to step back from Mara's management of the sale, to tell the agent there was no authority, and to meet with Helen and me. The crisis accelerated then. Mara, who had been speaking quietly about buyers and inspections, arranged for someone to inspect the orchard, without telling Daniel he had no right to discuss sale. The buyer came to look at apple trees with the same look the agent had. He measured rows and the pH levels of the soil. He asked about yields. Mara brought him cups of cider and a smile. She told him about the potential of 10 acres being rezoned. He scribbled on a pad and left a card. I called Helen and told her what had happened. We arranged a family meeting for a formal reading of the will. Helen would come. She asked that no one bring papers without notarized credentials. She said, one way or another, we will put the facts on the table. I felt, at that moment, the fragile weight of how reliant lives are on documents and on the truth of small signatures. I held the sealed envelope tighter in my handbag. I had told Helen I would bring it to the meeting. The night before the meeting, Mara invited more relatives and friends to dinner. The table was long and full and smelled of roast and an attempt at hospitality. She asked the questions of the group with an open hand, as if she were leading a choir rehearsal. At one point, she produced that forged document again and said, "This is the version Robert and Margaret settled on." She read a passage about distribution and left it at that. The room hummed with the comfort of a story made definitive. I felt the old knot of anger rise and then soften into something like exhaustion. I had not yet opened Robert's sealed letter. I sat with it until I could no longer do anything but lift the flap. He had written to me in that small, practical hand about contingencies. He had always imagined plans that could outsmart me. The letter contained a short paragraph and a second sheet that had recorded invocations. It said plainly that if any member of the family attempted to coerce or deceive to alter the ownership of the farm before my death, then certain consequences would be triggered to protect the land for the grandchildren and the community. He had recorded a short-spoken instruction to be played only in the event of family coercion. He had left, tucked into the same envelope, a sealed instruction that could be activated through Helen's office. There was a thin list of conditions and a statement that Daniel would inherit if he made good faith efforts to protect the farm. Reading it, I felt Robert near in that particular way. The dead can be present when they made the plans you need. He had not disinherited Daniel out of spite. He had placed obligations on inheritance because he wanted stewardship. He had a strong belief that land should not be artfully sold out of the family by those who thought money was the only measure of worth. I called Helen at 11 the next morning and asked for an emergency time. She arrived with her coat in hand and her notepad. She would not explain the letter to anyone over the phone, she said, but in her office she could and would verify it in a secure setting. At the estate meeting, Helen sat with the 2 copies of the will on the table. People streamed in. Mara looked composed. Daniel looked like he had not slept. Some of the relatives had seen the earlier forged version and nodded with the satisfaction of those who imagine plans already made. Helen placed the original will from the bank in front of us and slid the other copy, the one Mara had presented, across and matched them. She did not raise her voice. That would have been a theater act. Instead, she explained with a precision that felt like evidence. She said, "This copy has alterations. The signature block contains an anomaly. The paper and twine are different. The stamp is inconsistent." Mara started to talk in her defense. She said she had been given the older copy in good faith. She said that she had believed what she had been told. That was the sound of someone attempting to remain plausible. Helen paused, and then asked me if there were any other documents Robert had left beyond the will. I placed the sealed envelope on the table and watched color leave Mara's face. She attempted a smile and failed. Daniel watched the envelope too. He was afraid of what the contents might require of him. Helen opened the envelope in view of everyone. She read the short letter out loud. She then took a small recorder and played the recording Robert had made. It was a modest tape, his voice a little wind-brittle but steady. He said, "If any attempt is made to deceive or coerce Margaret in the disposal of the farm before her death, then the land shall be held in trust for the grandchildren and for the community's enjoyment until such time as Margaret directs otherwise." He said, "Further, Daniel shall inherit in full, only if he demonstrates that he had protected the farm from coercion and deception." He ended by saying, "Margaret knows the land and will protect its spirit." There was a hush like January. People shifted in their chairs. Mara clung to composure, but her fingers tightened white on the edge of the table. Helen did not thunder. She explained the consequences in a calm, detailed way without giving legal advice. She said the letter and the recording were conditional, but the conditions were clear about coercion and deception. When someone tries to alter the ownership through misrepresentation, the trust activates to protect the land for the grandchildren and the community. I watched faces blanch when Helen described that activation. Those who had imagined a sale saw their reflections fade. Mara demanded that the letter be invalid. She said Robert could not have meant that. She raised her voice as if raising it were an argument. A cousin mentioned that change might reduce taxes. Others looked helpless. The room felt like a courtroom without bars. Daniel stood up. His voice shook. He took responsibility in a way that looked like penance and repair. He said, "I was wrong. I thought I could help us by going along. I did not see the harm. I let myself be seduced by the plan. I did not tell my wife to stop. I apologize to you, Mother. I apologize to our family. I will live with the consequences." Mara looked at him as if he had betrayed her. He had. He had betrayed her plan. But his confession also peeled away the last plausible shelter of her scheme. She had relied on the complicity of silence. She had relied on the idea that people prefer to accept a plan that shimmers with profit. Helen then stated what actions would follow. She would verify the authenticity of the original will with the appropriate procedures. She would confirm the forgeries with handwriting and paper analysis, again in the correct channels. She would activate the conditional trust language in a way that I would consent to, because Robert had been careful to place me at the center of those decisions. That meant I would retain control of the farm while alive. It meant I could continue to live on it and care for it. It meant Daniel would receive a clear path to inheritance if he repaired trust and protected the land. It meant that if anyone attempted to sell the land through deception, the conservation clause would place parts of the orchard into community use for the grandchildren. It meant that there would be a path to prevent a rushed sale. Mara was furious. She said we were all making the wrong choices for the wrong reasons. She accused us of stifling opportunity. She spoke then of her mother and the need for a house in town. People began to take sides. The meeting threatened to devolve. Helen shut the meeting down with a gesture people in court recognize. She said, "This is not the moment for debate. This is the moment for process. We will document everything. We will act calmly and methodically. There is no need for threats. We will do our jobs." After the meeting, small consequences unfurled. The red sign came down. The agent called to apologize for any miscommunication and said he would close his file. Mara's mother, who had been cited in so many pleasant ways for having a right to move in, was given support to find a place in town. It was not a punitive move. It was practical. She was elderly and had long needed a smaller, better managed space. Her departure was necessary because our home needed to be the home of someone who remembered its steward. Mara left within a month. She did not speak much to Daniel. That was the saddest thing. She moved into a small apartment, if you could call a rented room an apartment. I spoke with her once on the phone and heard, under the fury, a woman who had been raised to believe that status was a sign of salvation. She had debts. She had wanted to buy safety with land. She had been frightened by the idea of being a small person in a large world. I did not banish her. I asked Helen to help make arrangements for Abigail, Mara's mother, to move with dignity. The farm could be generous without being foolish. The letter Robert wrote activated because of deception. It was there as a firewall, not as a pit. Robert had always been about fences to guide people away from harm, not traps meant to hurt. In the months after the estate meeting, Daniel and I worked to repair a relation that had been through strain. He took a job in town at a hardware shop, selling things for people fixing roofs. He came home most nights and sat at the kitchen table, and we talked about the orchard. He learned to prune in the winter. Those are humble acts that repay you in the spring. We made a small plan to keep the farm viable without selling off the soil. We rented the tenant cottage to a young teacher. We opened up a roadside stand for cider and pies that people loved. The grandchildren came in the summers and learned how to pick apples without bruising them, how to listen to the trees during cold nights. A part of the resolution was that a small portion of the land, a few acres that could create a community orchard, was placed lately and carefully into a conservation arrangement. The terms were not automatic. I made the choice with Helen and with Daniel. Robert's letter allowed the land to become protected in that way if I chose it after the crisis had passed. I chose to protect those acres because I wanted the children and the neighbors to have fruit of their own. If you plant a community orchard, you plant an invitation. The trick of all this was that the reversal we desired was nonviolent. We used dry ink and time and the law in the way I had expected. We used truth like a tool. The family did not break because of vengeance. Some relationships were frayed and some were mended. Daniel and I worked. Mara and I did not become close. I suspect we never will. Forgiveness requires a long path and the willingness to accept what cannot be changed. People sometimes ask me how I kept from blowing up the house that night with the red sign in it. When you have been married as long as I was, you learn that anger costs. It can set things afire. I chose the slower, quieter route because Robert taught me to believe in fences, not flames. I wrote down names and dates. I asked people to meet in rooms with witnesses. I made calls. I asked Helen for a medical capacity evaluation because the family had begun to talk about my memory as if that could be used like a passport for theft. The evaluation was an affirmation. It said I was competent to make decisions. It said I knew who I was and what I wished to do with my land. That evaluation became a shield that turned out to be necessary. People had begun to use kind phrases against me, and who is soft when you say old things with honey? A single sentence on a physician's paper made the difference between a rumor and a fact. It allowed Helen to proceed, and for the trust conditions to be considered legitimately active. There were small, very vivid moments that I keep like pebbles in my pocket. The red sign I pulled out of the ground with my hands the night before the meeting, rifling the soil with an old, practiced indifference, and thinking of it as a small piece of paper rather than a declaration. The apple crates stacked by the porch used to move fruit to market, and then to hide the little secrets of our kitchen. The locked desk drawer I opened with an old brass key to show Helen the letters Robert had kept. The missing page in the folder Mara had presented to me in the hospital. The hospital hallway scent. The old key that had opened the safe deposit. The family dinner where the forged will was placed on waxed wood like a test. The sealed envelope itself, and the lawyer's quiet pause before she set it on the table. When Helen read the recorded words out loud, there was a hush. People ask lawyers to be actors when drama is needed. She did not perform. She was only precise. She explained how the conditional trust would protect the orchard and the grandchildren's future. She also explained something that warmed me in a way I had not expected. She said, "Mr. Ellis built in a way for the land to be a place of community. He did not do it to punish, he did it to give the land a future. There are very few wills that speak with such care for the public good. He knew the town, and he knew you." I have to confess I did not expect to feel thankful for the document. There is a particular melancholy in finding that the person you loved was more prepared for your vulnerabilities than you were. I felt gratitude and also, for a second, an old sorrow. Robert was gone, and yet he had left this piece of himself behind. In the quiet weeks after, with the red sign removed and the agent gone, the farmhouse settled again into its own rhythm. I walked the orchard with Daniel at dawn when the cold was clean. The gate creaked in the way gates do when you have not oiled them for a while. We opened it together and let the grandchildren run down the lane to the trees. I felt how small acts of repair can be more powerful than any one stand of anger. There were conversations with Mara that were short and sharp. She accused me of keeping her from her future for the sake of an old man's hobby. She told me her mother had been promised a room. I told her the truth. She did not accept it. She left to make a life that had other forms of security. Her departure felt like an amputation to her identity. It did not feel like a victory to me. Part of me wonders how many families tilt toward this kind of knife, where property becomes a battlefield and old objects become the years turned on edge. It is easy to sell what you do not see as a living thing. The farm, for me, is a living place. The apple trees are not merely currency. They are memory, future, a small work of art that will feed children and old folk and neighbors. Passing that along, when it needs steadiness, is not a matter of cold utility. It is a moral plan. The day Helen closed the file and left a record of guardian-like instructions, I walked the orchard alone. The air smelled like cut grass and apple skin. The sun was a low coin. I sat on an old crate used once for cider and looked at the nearest tree. A branch leaned toward me like an elbow. I put my hand on its bark. I had a small demonstration of patience of how to shore things up. It is not dramatic. It is ordinary and true. At night Daniel and I would talk about the farm in practical terms, about pruning and the winter shelter for the bees. We would say thank you to Robert in small ways. We were building a new rhythm. A community orchard was being planned, not as a sudden giveaway, but as a chosen legacy. I wanted children in the neighborhood to learn how to tend trees. I wanted the land to be a place of gatherings where the town could have a permanent stand and where the grandchildren could find fruit when they came of age. Mara's mother visited once in the spring. I brought a mug of tea to her small rented room, and together we looked at a photograph of the farmhouse. She was quiet, she said. "She loved you, you know." I nodded. There are things you do not have to explain. You do not have to make the wound a spectacle. In my handbag there is still the small voice recorder that captured a few of the conversations. I am not sentimental enough to keep everything, but I kept enough to make a trail. People sometimes ask if it felt cruel to collect the evidence. No, it felt right. It felt like someone in a town keeping a ledger. That ledger is not meant to punish, but to guarantee the continuity of a thing worth keeping. I tell you all of this not because I am proud. I am not. I tell you because sometimes the quietest person has to set a very loud boundary that does not require noise. It requires documents, witnesses, and the willingness to stay. The farm continues to be my stewardship. I make decisions about the land while I am able. Daniel will inherit when the time comes, and he has the explicit path to a fair share if he protects the land in good faith. Mara has a life of her own, and a chance to repair some of the things she broke. Her mother has a warm apartment. The grandchildren will have a protected orchard. A portion of the property will be conserved with community access, only because I chose it, not because someone beat me down to it. A few weeks after the estate meeting, I opened the farmhouse gate at sunrise. I did not open it to defend the property from family so much as to welcome the grandchildren into a future where truth and patience would matter. The dawn was thin and sharp. The gate made its old, familiar creak. The children ran past me toward the trees with a whoop that was not loud enough to wake the town. I stood there a long time, hand on the gate, thinking of Robert leaning against the barn beam, of the way he used to say, "Keep the fence in repair and the land will do the rest." The image that rose in me and stayed was not of a courtroom or a battle. It was of a small child clambering up an apple crate and reaching for fruit. That is the future Robert wanted. That is the future I will defend. Now I ask you, after listening to my story, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? And if this story touched you, please subscribe.